The next menu item we're going to look at is the terrain menu. And in the terrain menu, we have the ability to create a terrain. We can manipulate the terrain by changing up the height of it, by changing textures, applying assets and objects like trees and rocks to it, and constructing a terrain for our environment. The only option that's available to us when we first get here, though, is going to be the Create Terrain. We have additional options in here which are grayed out, which don't become available until we've actually created a terrain, and then we can start to use those type of options. So I'm going to start off by going to the Create Terrain. And when we do this, we can see inside of the scene view, we have a nice little plane in here. I say little, but it is rather large. It's a nice sized terrain as a default. And this plane, let's go ahead and switch our view. We've got a texture view. We're going to change our draw mode to a texture wire so that we can see the actual geometry as we work with it. Now, when we create this plane, this terrain, we can look inside the hierarchy. We can see that we have a terrain that's added to the hierarchy, and inside of the project, we have a new terrain added as an asset. If we look over to the right-hand side in the inspector, we can see that we have our transform, which is nice and normal, but below that, we have our terrain script, which was added from our project, and below that, we have our terrain collider. The terrain collider is simply there to assist us with collisions, so that if we have any rigid bodies or colliders of some kind, that we can actually have them affected by the terrain and the environment that we run around on. So let's focus in first on our terrain script right in here. The terrain script provides us with a number of tools that we can use to manipulate the geometry, the surface of our terrain. We can also paint on the terrain and actually paint in texture and details that way. We can also put trees, plant trees all over the environment by painting those on. We can put flowers and trees and rocks and things like that as well. And we also have an additional just settings at the end to do settings for light maps and such things as that. Before we actually get to editing and working with the tools, I want to go back to the terrain menu. I want to take a look at the options we have in there. Now that we've created the terrain, we now have an import height map, we have an export height map, and these two options allow us to bring in or export out a black and white image file, just a 2D image file, where the black and white image file represents the height, black being the lowest area, white being the highest area, and using those to actually construct the height data on our terrain map. These might be things you've exported out from other software applications like Terragen or things like that that can create that height map that you can use. Below that, we have an option to set the resolution. Now, if you know the type of resolution you're going to be working with, the size of the map that you're going to be working with, as soon as you create the terrain, your best bet is to go ahead and set the resolution, because any additional adjustments that you might make to the terrain, if you make adjustments, then set the resolution, you're going to lose a lot of those adjustments. So let's go ahead and start off by setting the resolution. When we do the set height map resolution, we can see the little dialog menu show up, and in here we have the option for the terrain width and the terrain height. So let's go ahead and set this. So the terrain width is set at 2000. We could set the terrain height at 600. Let's go ahead and make this a little bit smaller. We're going to tighten this up some. We're going to make it just 1000 by 1000. The terrain height, we're going to set it all the way up to 1000. The terrain length, we're going to set it to 1000. Now the height map resolution. What's the height map resolution for our object? Right now it's set to 513. Let's go ahead and bump this one up a little bit more. Let's set this to a 1024. The detail resolution, let's set the detail resolution up to a 2048. The control texture resolution is set at 512. We're going to go ahead and leave this one at 512, and the base texture resolution at 1024. That's going to be fine for the textures. We'll go ahead and set resolution. Now, as we do, you can see that the map is now shrunk down to 1000 by 1000. We've increased our resolution on our mesh. And this way we might be able to get a little bit more detail out of the map that we're working with. Now, the next couple of options we have in there are a mass place trees, which allow us to place a lot of trees on our map. Number of trees, how many trees, and we can place all of those at once. We actually have to have a tree loaded up in order to do that. Look at that in just a moment. The flatten height map allows us to flatten our height map. This can be useful. We can go ahead and flatten our height map up higher than 0, so that if we want to use the inverse of our sculpting tool where we're raising and lowering, we can't lower below 0. But if we'll raise our entire map above 0, then we could lower it down as we start to sculpt on it. So I'm going to go ahead and raise this one up to, let's say, about 100. This is raise my map up. That way when we start to sculpt on it, we can actually sculpt down and work with our map that way. Our last option is a refresh tree and detail prototypes, and this is just a refreshing option when you're dealing with some of the vegetation. Okay, that's going to do it for our terrain menu. The next thing we want to look at is to actually break out the tools that we'll use to sculpt, to paint, to create assets on our terrain. But before we do that, we need to actually go in and bring some assets into our scene that we can use to plant and work with on our terrain. So I'm going to go into my edit, my assets, I'm going to do import package, and on my import package I'm simply going to go to my editor, and in here we should have one for our terrain assets. We're going to load up that package for the terrain assets. Comes up, you can select on it to see what the assets are. We've got some texture files, we've got some tree objects. We'll make sure everything is selected. We'll say import. You see it's importing it into our project. In our project we now have a standard assets folder, terrain assets, we've got grass, textures that we can use, and a palm tree that we can use inside this project.